Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our fourth of 5 programs on human flourishing in our modern times. Today, we're going to look at the relationship between the modern notions of flourishing and ancient wisdom from which we all need to draw in a time such as ours of fractious information and polarized worldviews. Today, I want to begin by continuing our ongoing witnessing of the genocide going on in Gaza. You may have noted that in the news today, it was not in Rafah where the news was, where half of the Palestinian population or more are concentrated, waiting for the final assault by the Israelis. It was in Khan Yunis town, just to the north of Rafah, bearing in mind that Gaza is only 25 miles long and 5 miles wide. The Israelis launched their final assault on the last remaining hospital in Khan Yunis. After several weeks of laying siege to the hospital, Israeli snipers picking off and shooting hospital personnel as they were entering and leaving the hospital, focusing on children and women. They're culminated today in coming into the hospital with bulldozers, wrecking balls, demolishing the maternity ward, the emergency ward. They bulldozed over the makeshift graveyard that had been created outside the hospital in one of the courtyards because there's so many dead. And the Israelis will not let people go to the customary graveyard. So the hospital built that. They bulldozed that over and they knocked down the walls of the hospital. That's what genocide looks like. There was no military target. It is simply the demolition of human infrastructure in an attempt to wipe away the Palestinians in Gaza. And the whole world knows that. And so today I want to deepen my reflections on what does love mean in Gaza? What does love mean in a time of genocide? I realized after my remarks yesterday that I felt they were in some ways superficial. I commented on Muhammad's observation in the Hadith that compassion for the oppressor means that you have to stop the oppressor. We talked about what it means to love one's enemy. Throughout the day, I felt discomfort with that. And I began to realize that the deeper question if love is God and God is love and love is everywhere because God is everywhere. And love resides in the heart of everything that exists as the bonding, gravitational force that coalesces all of reality and offers us up upon the altar of beauty. Love is working in Gaza. Love is present in the children being shot and in the bulldozers knocking over the hospital, covering up the graveyard. I can hardly bear to think that thought. And yet, reflect on it. We must. And as I was pondering this as the day wore on, I began to remember a story from the Torah, from the book of Genesis. You all remember the story of Joseph in his many-colored coat, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who was favored by his father as his favorite son. And the other 11 brothers got very jealous. And they tormented Joseph, finally threw him into a deep well. And somehow he survived, and then they came back, somewhat remorseful, and then decided to sell him into slavery in Egypt to some passing traders. So Joseph was bound, ended up in the house of Potiphar, the first servant of the Pharaoh. Potiphar's wife lusted after Joseph. He refused to consent. So she had him put in prison. And in prison, he had dreams, and he began to interpret the dreams of the other prisoners. Finally, he was led to interpret the dream of the Pharaoh. When all of Pharaoh's wise men could not. And all of a sudden, Joseph was elevated to oversee all of Egypt as it prepared for the 7 years of famine that he foresaw. And the famine affected Canaan, where his 11 brothers and his father Jacob and his mother Rachel were. And finally, his family had to come down into Egypt because they had run out of food, not knowing that Joseph was overseeing all of Egypt. Eventually, he revealed himself to his brothers. And right at the end of the book of Genesis, chapter 51, there's an extraordinary exchange between Joseph and his brothers. They apologized. And Joseph said to them, "You meant what you did as evil to me, but God meant it unto me for good, to save many people alive this day." Embedded even in the crucifixion of Jesus 2,000 years ago is this paradox of love. That a man could be crucified on a cross and somehow, in some miraculous way, love was present. Love was working for an end beyond the imagination of the perpetrators to save many people alive this day. Is that what grace is? Is grace embedded in the heart of love? That no matter the malignancy of human darkness, the light will still shine. And it was only 80 years ago that the Jewish people went through their own crucifixion. And out of that came Israel, holding these contradictions and understanding that in the contradiction itself, love is both the totality and the interstices that bind. Something that I've been reflecting on and just wanted to share with you today. And so as I saw the news about the destruction of the hospital in Khan Yunis, I could feel that in my heart. I also know that in some way beyond our understanding, love works. And just like the Jews were risen up after the Holocaust, so too will the Palestinians be risen up after their Holocaust. And that's why love endures. There is nothing outside love, nothing underneath it, nothing above it. It is what binds everything that is into a unitary whole. And living out these contradictions is the anvil of human life. I'd like to close my reflections as we begin our session today with T.S. Eliot. Of all the modern poets, T.S. Eliot understood this deep truth, which blinds the eye when you look at it, but opens up the heart when you ponder it. The dove descending breaks the air with flames of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the one discharge from sin and error. Our only choice, or else despair, lies in the choice of pyre or pyre. To be redeemed from fire by fire. Who then devised this torment? Love. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the intolerable shirt of flame that human power cannot remove. We only live, only suspire to be consumed by fire or fire. The dove descending breaks the air with flames of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the only discharge from sin and error. Our only hope, or else despair, lies in the choice between pyre and pyre. To be redeemed from fire, by fire. Who designed this torment? Love. Love. Love is the force behind the hands that weave the intolerable shirt of flame that human power cannot remove. No one can spare the Palestinians from the suffering they are now enduring. We only live, only suspire to be consumed by fire. Fire. So thank you, everyone, for joining Humanity Rising as we continue to bear witness to genocide in Gaza. It's my pleasure now to introduce my very good friend and colleague, Tom Eddington, who I love as a brother and who has been a pillar of Humanity Rising. Tom, thank you so much for everything that you do and convening with Carson Kelly this week on Flourishing. I turn the program over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And as always, thank you for your opening comments. I often find myself at a loss for what to share, and today is certainly one of those days. I think where I'm left is just knowing that with what's happening in the world, the only way I can reconcile it, the only way I can make sense of it, is to recognize that anytime we're in a moment of hatred, we're in a moment of anger, we can go to our heart and recognize that that anger, that hatred is self-administered poison. And if we can stop drinking the poison and open our hearts to love, then suddenly things can make sense. We can be open to compassion. We can, for the other, for ourselves. And I'm particularly delighted to be in this conversation today. There's so much to learn from the wisdom traditions. There's thousands of years of history that can help inform and help interpret what's happening in the world. And particularly delighted, Carson, that we're having this conversation today. So welcome, and let's jump into today's program.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Jim, for your incredible words today. They've been really very, at least for me, very profound all week. Today was very beautiful. Thank you. Also, thank you, too, again, for your invitation to be a part of the Humanity Rising podcasting efforts. As I've said before, I really appreciate this opportunity to bring forward some of my colleagues who I've had the great good fortune to come into relationship with and showcase the amazing work that they're doing to create a more compassionate and a more flourishing world. My name is Carson Kelly, and I'm the founder of Compassion 2.0. And for those of you who don't know, this Compassion 2.0 is a collection of professionals who are trying to scale compassion through the intentional architecture of compassionate human experience that can really ultimately be measured. We do this through the creation of compassionate and flourishing frameworks through both product development and organizational structure, architecture. Our community consists of HR leadership, organizational developers, product developers, neuroscientists, behavioral scientists, medical doctors, UX, UI designers, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and more, teachers, educators. And as Jim had said in his opening remarks, this week we're generally looking at modern flourishing from the perspective of the global North. We recognize that in our predominantly Western point of view and reference that our modern organizations and society and culture have created great challenges for us as individuals and as families and communities. And this is clearly reflected in some of the more recent numbers and expressions of increased mental illness and loneliness and depression and people feeling isolated. So we look to try to address that. And we know that there's a lot to learn from cultures all over the world, particularly in the global South, things that they've understood deeply and have held close. And we have the opportunity to learn from that and attempt to do so. So again, as we've been doing through this week, we've been looking at modern flourishing through lenses of neuroscience, medical science, group and organizational dynamics, individual practices, and so forth. And today, we're looking at it through the perspective of ancient wisdom for a modern frame. And we hope that the listeners enjoyed this week and had the opportunity to, from previous days and also today in particular and tomorrow, to be able to find different modalities or different pathways that might resonate for them to help them increase their own flourishing and or self-compassion and ultimately compassion in the world. The views expressed by the individuals on this program are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. I've asked our guests to join the conversation today in a professional manner to discuss and to share their work. So with that, today I'm joined by several practitioners and developers of what I think are amazing frameworks. Friend Scott Snibbe is joining us today from Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment. That's a podcast that he's run for the past several years, brilliant podcast series, and he's the host of that. And then he's here to talk today about his upcoming book, How to Train a Happy Mind. So Scott will be here. And also two other folks, Shivani Modi and Ankur Jain are both the co-founders of a technology platform called Seeker. And I'm going to put that in the chat just because the spelling's a little bit fun. But if Scott wants to join us, you're welcome to. But it's nice to see Ankur and Shivani and okay, very good. So it's great to have all of you here. I just will say at the outset that I hold a special place for me in my heart for all three of you in a variety of different ways. So it's with great pleasure to have you here. So Ankur Shivani for sure is in New Delhi, India right now, where it's getting a little bit later in terms of her time zone. And Ankur, I'm not sure if he's in Delhi or somewhere else, but he too is probably somewhere in India, and it's probably a little bit later there, no matter where he is. So with that, with deep respect, we will start with them, and then we'll turn our attention to Scott. So welcome, Ankur. Welcome, Shivani.
Thank you.
I'm just going to start at the top. Tell us about Seeker.
Jim, thank you for that opening. And I think it leaves me overwhelmed, stumped. It also makes me think about the work that we are doing, how important it is in the context of the kind of violence and genocide and all sorts of other crimes that we witness every day and hear of. So Seeker is a research and technology platform. It's been set up to spread mind literacy across the world. There was a time about 2,500 years ago where India contributed to 25% of global GDP. It was home to the most advanced learning systems such as in the world, such as Taxila and Nalanda. And this is much before the advent of universities in Europe. And this great economy was based on a culture of excellence, very much like the flourishing that we speak about today. So this culture was created through an education system that taught mind and attention literacy. And this was taught along with all the domain knowledges that people studied. And over the years, this system was lost due to political environment, a lot of invasions that we faced, and ultimately colonization. And as a consequence of that, today, we make rockets, we make medicine, we do everything using our mind. Everything that we have ever studied, we have studied using our mind. But no one teaches us how to use our mind. And we don't spend any time understanding ourselves. So we created Seeker to revive the mind and attention literacy. And we want to take it to schools and colleges across the world. And we call this the Mind Mastery Movement. So that's Seeker.
And I can say, just for the audience, I've had the good fortune to spend some time learning about the mind mastery movement, the program, the framing, and to learn some of the structural components to Seeker, the platform, which these guys will talk about. And it is truly profound, unbelievably brilliant. So I'm just going to put my shameless opinion on the table there as we go forward. But okay, so obviously it's not about me. Let's talk more about you. So tell us about your background and how you came to create the Seeker platform, which is a yogic-based AI, essentially. So tell us about that.
Thanks, Carson, for having us. And yeah, I think after what Jim spoke, we should have 1 hour of silence. But given the commitment to everybody here, let's talk. So basically, it's the kind of concerns Jim raised and a lot of people said in the comment box. Those were the kind of concerns. Seeker has 3 co-founders, Kaushalji, Shivani, and I. All 3 of us had similar concerns, less with the world, more with our own lives. I guess we were all seekers. We were looking for how to live, what to live. We had common questions. What is consciousness? How does it work? Etc. And we followed this path for several years, several decades of our life separately. In 2016, we came together and put in some capital into a single company and started up a formal research project, which brought together all of our background researches under one roof to answer these questions for ourselves and for everybody else. And the place, because of our backgrounds, we started with was scriptures, ancient yogic and Vedantic scriptures. Kaushalji also brings a wealth of knowledge from Buddhism with it, but largely he is a PhD in yoga, but we're all students of Vedanta also. From there, we found a very interesting thing when we started inquiring that all these scriptures are basically about the mind and attention, right? So this is probably the most ancient form of psychology. We call it yoga and Vedanta psychology. Yeah. And all these scriptures have frameworks that classify the mind and attention into various states. So 3 states, 7 states, 5 states, many kind of states. So we started putting all these scriptures together, and from there came a master framework, which now we call the causal mind model. The causal mind model, what it does is it identifies all the possible states of what we call attention, the manifestation of consciousness, right? And energy, which is the other manifestation of consciousness, and the mind, all mind states. And this totals to about 351 in our framework. So there are 351 mindsets, and it's so hard to calculate this manually. So we created an AI, which is called the Yogi Meter. And this measures your cognitive attention score. This AI, based on your sleeping and eating habits, in a 5-minute test, can tell you which of the 351 mindset you are using currently, what are the impact it has on your choice making with respect to health, with respect to relationships, finances, effectiveness, etc. And then what are the consequences of that choice making? So that's the one thing that we did with our research. The other thing we did is we converted this into courses where you can learn one of the courses, which immersive courses that Carson attended, he was talking about. Then there are simpler workshop level courses for entry level people. So you learn what is the mind, what is the attention, how does it work, what are the fields of mind and attention, how can you manage it in a day-to-day life in the modern context. So this is largely what our work is. Yeah.
That's brilliant. So I feel like I'm kind of cheating because I know some familiarity. Tell us a little bit about the notion within the platform around goal-mindedness in the sense of how that creates flourishing, particularly in today's environment. Like, what is the basis of that? Unpack that a little for us.
Okay, so there are a couple of ways to understand this. Let's start with the modern context. So, all of you are familiar with the lawsuits on some of the social media companies that are going on, and they've been accused of deliberately manipulating attention to manipulate your hormones, to get you addicted, to make you more sedentary, which in turn induces anxiety, depression, self-harm tendencies, etc. This is the subject matter of these hearings and these lawsuits now. So what this says is that it is possible to manipulate attention and lead to endocrine consequences or hormonal consequences, which change your biochemistry, right? So what the yogic practices we research and the framework we research does the opposite. We teach you systems of manipulating your attention deliberately to move it from what we call attention fluctuation to attention control, right? And this attention control leads to a better focus, a better state of being. Now, this is what we call goal-mindedness, right? Another way to understand it is that in human mind is looking for pleasure, comfort, confidence all the time, right? And it has two directions. The unsustainable direction is when you look for comfort in the couch, in the bed, when you look for confidence in comfort zones, known people, known areas of life. And the sustainable form of confidence comes from when you face challenges, right? So different parts of the mind get active, whether it's the dopamine cycle you are using or the performance hormones you are using, testosterone kind of hormones. So, different parts of the mind give rise to sustainable confidence, sustainable comfort. This is what goal-mindedness really is. So what our framework does is it teaches you goal-mindedness. It reduces attention fluctuation. It narrows your focus. It moves you towards flourishing because you are self-regulated. Your independence increases, your dependence on your circumstances, on people, on material things, even on your own body goes down, right?
Just clarifying something there in the text. So when you think about the work that you're doing today, because oftentimes when I talk to people about Seeker, it's such a profound thing. Essentially, as I understand it, again, as you said, it's a deconstruction of the Vedantic and or yogic texts, and then a reconstruction I should say, a deconstruction, and I don't want to use I'm going to use the word simplification, but not in a negative sense. It's an elegance is what it is, and that's in that way. It's taking something complicated and making it very elegant, and then structured. It makes it therefore simple, and then it gets turned into an AI where questions can be asked and answered, and those inputs then provide the outputs that are helpful for that particular person. So it's bespoke. So it's truly really brilliant in my humble opinion. When you think about the practitioners that are using, say, the Seeker platform today, versus if we could put ourselves, thousands of years ago, back in older India, how would you say that the difference, how does that show up in terms of how a practitioner that might have been using Seeker versus, say, using the traditional text 1,000 years ago? I'm not sure I'm being very clear here, but
Okay, so
outside of iPhones and machines, of course. But
let me try and answer, or let me try and answer what I think you've asked me. Okay. So one fundamental question, difference between that time and today is that the most best paid people were coders, people who were coding, right? It was same that time and today. Today, they are coding software. They're using language that give instruction to microchips and microprocessors, right? And you're getting computers and robots to do things for you. That's what you're coding. That time, Sanskrit, the language, was separate. Sanskrit was also used as code. But that code was used to program your nervous and your endocrine system to be resilient, to be a super achiever, to be goal-minded, to not get affected by addictive loops, to overcome compulsive thinking, to be focused, to get to a point of attention control where you could find answers, to spike cognition, right? So that fundamentally the approach to life was different.
yeah.
Does that?
Totally. I love your metaphor around that, in the sense of Sanskrit as code in that way. That somehow resonates with me. Before we go on, because I have, again, more questions about just generally about flourishing, Tom, I just wanted to open it up. Is there anything that's kind of up for you that you want to speak to? If not, I have other questions and other things to explore. You're on mute right now.
Thank you, Carson, and thank you, Shivani and Ankur. I was listening to your opening comments, Shivani, about the history of India, and while I truly appreciate the history, I also want to acknowledge that I hold India as the spiritual heart of the world. And what I so appreciate about what the two of you are doing is you're contributing to the consciousness of humanity, the consciousness of the world, coming from the heart of the world, the spiritual home of the world. And it's beautiful that energy, that history of what India has been for thousands of years is making another contribution to the evolution of humanity. And it's beautiful. So thank you for the work, and let's continue helping our audience understand the work that you're up to and what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom.
So building along these lines of what we were just speaking to then, is flourishing something that's different today than it is from back then?
So I think, okay, let's look at flourishing from our framework for a second then, and then we'll talk about differences. So there, the fundamental thing that we call consciousness, when it manifests in human beings, it becomes attention, right? As this attention is subtle. As it becomes gross, it becomes energy. So it's like energy and attention are actually both the same thing. One is the gross form, one is subtle form. It's like drawing dollars and pounds from the same bank. You're depleting the same bank, whether you, so it's either energy or attention, right? So now your energy and attention goes into three things. It is spent in physiological functions, so to manage the body. Second, it's spent in emotions. And third, it's spent in cognition, learning, discipline, self-regulation, right? So cognition, emotion, physiology. Now, what happens is that when you start spending your energy on emotion, excessively on emotion, energy and attention on emotion, your physiological functions rise, right? So heart rates, breathing
Rise.
rates, everything goes up, right? So with all this, your cognition reduces because essentially it's the same resource. So your learning reduces, your calmness reduces, the quality of your decision making reduces. So this is going on like maths, like it would happen to a machine, right? So what our system shows is that there are 19 final emotional spikes, 19 causes of emotional spikes that we have come up with through all these frameworks when you look at them. And these 19 in different combinations make the 351 mindsets, right, that I spoke about. Now, the state of flourishing, what you describe in psychology and modern, mental well-being practices, this is when you reach a state of 3 or less of those 19 emotional instabilities, right? At that time, your cognition is so high. Yeah, and I'll talk about that in the context of love. When Jim was talking about love, it just kept coming to me all the time, and how love exists in everything. So this was but and as this 19 increases, you move from flourishing to languishing. You keep getting dependent, and everything starts to bother you. Weather bothers you, what people call you bother you, who looks at you bother. So it becomes a complicated game, right? To paranoia, suicide, right? Like it could become really ugly. Now, when you move up this ladder, right, and the emotional spikes go down, cognition's very high. That time, so one of the big misconceptions I find when I deal with people, teach people, I'm speaking on various forums, is that people think empathy is about emotion. Actually, it's not. Empathy is a cognitive act where you understand other people's emotion. You're able to understand them. You're able to stand in their shoes. It's not about your own feelings and emotions. You're above your so leadership and love, true compassion, these are all cognitive functions, right? And I often ask people this question, in this love that he spoke about that came in crucifixion, this love that he spoke about, which intertwines. What is that love? So let's take some earthly examples of it. When John Lennon wrote a song like Imagine, or when he sung it, do you think he sung it for himself or somebody else? Right? When the greatest music is created, when the greatest art is created, when the greatest monuments are created, when the internet gets created, when greatest technologies are created, is that person doing it for himself or for the others? You don't know the answer, right? Gita calls it, the Bhagavad Gita has a term for it. It's called Sarvbhut Hiterata, means the common good of all. Means that which is not good for you or for me or for somebody else. It's common good for all. There is a point of that. It's the all love. And there's a level of the mind where the emotional fluctuations, the reactiveness goes so low, so diminutive. You're so clear-headed, your consciousness is so high, your cognition is so high that you get those answers. Then you are working 100% selfishly, but it's yet 100% selfless. There's no difference. You know, I hope I'm able to explain you. And I think when you look at that, flourishing in that sense, you wonder if it can ever change. If it's not a universal concept and it's not a timeless concept, right? In that sense.
I thank you. I'm just looking at time and just thinking, because we could do this for hours. I mean, I'm easy, and we have actually, I should say, we've had the great good fortune to have these longer conversations in the past. So I have to just to be mindful. So I'm going to put a gentle bookmark there to come back to it, because I'd like to turn our attention to Scott for a moment and have Scott. First off, I'd like to hear everything about Skeptic's path, about the book that's coming up. But Scott, do you have any response as a longtime Buddhist practitioner?
There's so much that resonates there. The very first thing that Shivani mentioned was Nalanda University, which is where everything I'm talking about was developed. Nalanda University, if I could go back in time, that would be the place I would visit. It was, as far as we know, the world's first residential university, and its focus was on absolutely perfecting the best qualities of human beings. And they more or less succeeded. That was where the type of meditation that I write about in my book called analytical meditation was developed. A type of meditation that leverages storytelling, feelings, and critical thinking, rather than just kind of the focused mindfulness that people are familiar with. So I think that there were so many things that you mentioned that I resonated with. And also Buddhist ethics, we're talking about a little bit about, what does it take to be a good human being? How do you embody love? And in the book, I try to distill Buddhist ethics to its essence, which I got from Alan Wallace, where he says Buddhist ethics is nonviolence. The very first principle of Buddhist ethics is nonviolence, as everybody's been talking about here. Kindness is the second principle, to be kind. Then the last one is really surprising, and it really resonates with, what Ankur and Shivani were mostly talking about, understanding your mind. The third principle of ethics is to understand your mind. And that is the huge adventure of analytical meditation, what my book is about and the organization teaches. And it is very deeply aligned with what Shivani and Ankur talk about. Buddhism it builds upon, or perhaps, it has its own little parallel road from the Indian Vedic traditions that they developed. From the Buddhist perspective, they developed most of the techniques, and then the Buddha had a couple of interesting innovations during his life. The particular one being that asceticism wasn't effective for his path, and he went to a middle way where he could have some reasonable amount of food and comfort to take care of his body, and eventually attain enlightenment. So I could go on, but those are just a few resonances with what you were saying. Wonderful.
Yeah. So thank you. Because I was watching if I could see you kind of respond like, yeah. So it was cool. I was like, I knew these guys would really enjoy being together. So on a more mundane level, Scott, tell us about, Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment, just that project that you've been doing. And then of course, tell us about the book.
Sure. Well, the podcast and the book are both really to do the same thing, although the book is in a highly refined form. What I had noticed is that meditation is taking off throughout the Western world, but it's primarily a specific type of meditation called mindfulness, which is in Buddhism, it's actually a tiny aspect and one of these, one of many mental factors like Ankur was talking about, which is how to focus and also how to be, a bit less reactive. So it's kind of like a ground. And people practice this type of meditation to become, to reduce stress, to anxiety, to focus better at work, things like that. So meditation is being used primarily therapeutically in the secular form, throughout the West, which is wonderful. But what I wanted to do is help people who are ready for it to understand the other aspect of meditation. The definition of meditation from a Buddhist perspective is to bring out your best qualities. So it's actually not just to kind of deal with a therapeutic level of treating difficulties, but to bring out love, compassion, patience, generosity, kindness, joy, compassion, etc. And it's like I often say it's like a Swiss Army knife for the mind. There are so many different techniques of analytical meditation that antidote certain real world problems, but promote certain virtues, what I might call character benefits. And so I've taken a sequence that was developed, in this Nalanda lineage about 1,500 years ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, by Atisha, called the Lam Rim, which is a kind of condensation ordering of the Buddha's teachings. And I've made it secular, so I've been teaching meditation for 18 years, and I was invited to teach this path to ordinary people who weren't Buddhist. But the very first topic mentions three things that haven't been established by science yet: karma, past and future lives, and other realms. And so it made me very uncomfortable because we were advertising these sessions for people who weren't Buddhists, but then talking about things from a Buddhist worldview that, haven't been established by science, modern psychology. I'm not saying they aren't true. In fact, I actually believe in them. But to adapt a path for people who don't believe in those things. His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote a book called Beyond Religion that encouraged people to do this. So I'd like to emphasize I'm not going rogue here. Also, my teacher, Lama Yeshe, said this in 1984. He says, put the teachings into a scientific, like non-religious framework. So inspired by that and taking careful steps with my teachers and students, I was experimenting for about 12, 15 years. And the podcast, I used to joke, I used to be a part-time Buddhist, now I'm a full-time Buddhist. So I started this organization 4 years ago to do that. So the book and the organization distill this into 8 steps in brief meditations that you have to do them more frequently. You don't just do them once and transform. But if you do practice them consistently, they are coherent with the authentic ways that these meditations have been practiced for at least 1,000 years, and yet don't require you to take on beliefs that that aren't coherent with a modern view of reality.
Cool. Things are so intense. So I'm at a loss for words. One of the things I would ask you, and actually both of you really, or all three of you, is there's definitely a trend, and Tom, by all means, jump in at any point when you feel you'd like. I know that your schedule has some constraints on you, so if you have anything you'd like to speak to, please do so. But I will say that it feels to me, from what little I know about His Holiness, is that the work, the current work of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, or I should say the work coming from the Dalai Lama in particular, through the Mind and Life Institute and other sorts of engagement, where he has brought various scientists around him, so physicists and psychologists, neuroscientists, and so on, to engage in these larger scientifically based conversations. And two, just as an aside, Seeker has also published a paper on their work that's tied to, and I'll have you speak to that in a moment, in terms of some of the scientific thinking around the brain and some of the neurobiology there. I guess the question somewhere in all of my rambling is, how do we continue to lean into that? Is that where we're headed with this beautiful wisdom that's come, that's some cases 5,000 years old, coming, and I agree with Tom, from the spiritual heart of the planet? Is it really continuing to head into a scientific frame? Do we feel like that's the needed thing for adoption by, in this case, the Western mind? I don't know. I apologize. I'm not being very clear. So Scott, I'll start with you, and then I'll conquer if you have anything you want to add there.
I do have some thoughts. So I've read all of those the Mind and Life books, and really, really benefited from them. So one aspect of how science is engaging with Buddhism, which His Holiness really, really spearheaded and is an advocate of, is using science to validate some of the claims of meditation. And that is happening. Now, the thing is, science uses external measures of validation and measurement, but meditation is a fundamentally subjective inner experience. So there are, at least today, there are limits to that. There are many things you can't measure about meditation success. And the way I do mention some of these, wonderful results of validating meditation scientifically, but I'll tell you the way that I tend to use science more in these meditations is to give you a sense of awe and purpose and meaning and interconnection. Like in many ways, the way that we now understand the universe can provide the same sense of awe, a sense of living eternally. Like in Buddhism, you have a sense that you live forever. You have infinite past lives, infinite future ones, and you can evolve your consciousness towards more positive, constructive, beneficial states. Now, for a person who doesn't believe that, what I've found is the science is so extraordinary in like understanding our place in the universe. Like the first topic in the sequence is the precious life. So how amazing it is to have a life. Voltaire once said, it's no more miraculous to have one life than two." So to find that sense of miraculousness in realizing that we're at the tip of 4 billion years of evolution, 200,000 years of humanity, 14 billion years of the universe. For everything we know, we may be the only creatures. We're the only creatures we know of right now that have the ability to understand the universe, look deeply into our minds, find the causes of, the ultimate evolution of mind towards its highest purpose and potential. You see that you don't have to say anything that to some people would seem supernatural, but you can generate the same feeling that people had from those understanding the world through the belief of rebirth, karma, and so on. So I wanted to emphasize that because it's something that's not talked about much, and it's how I use science is more for that sense of awe, connection, interdependence, and responsibility. Like if we're really the tip of the evolutionary pinnacle in our galaxy or maybe the universe, what do you want to do with this day? How do you want to? Do you want to binge watch a show on Netflix? Maybe there's something better you could do with your time.
Yeah, understood. Fascinating. Yeah, I just keep coming back to this place where even with the ethics, for instance, speaking about, in this case, Tibetan Buddhist ethics from the Dalai Lama, practice is to continue to strip away the religious frame. And this is some of the common ground that I see personally with Seeker and the work that you're doing and others that are out there. Not to say that the religious frame is bad. I'm not suggesting that, but it's a new language that's coming forward in a manner that I think speaks to a new mind, if you will, not new in the sense of its series of incarnations or its age or what have you, but the sense of just the current or contemporary language and voice and or code, if you will, to borrow a phrase from Ankur, that seems to resonate. It's fascinating. So Ankur, I would love, and or Shivani, I would love just to speak to the basis of the science that you guys are exploring too with Seeker.
So, okay,
Yeah,
you go.
go ahead.
Ladies first. Shivani, go ahead.
You go
Shivani.
first.
So the way I like to look at this is modern science is the science we're familiar with. It's the one we trust. It's the one we've been educated in. And what we're trying to do is use the framework of modern science to explain as we understand an ancient science. And where they meet is, it's not as if you're trying to make it scientific. It was always scientific. In fact, in all of our work, what we're finding is there was precision. There is predictability. There is understanding. So it takes a lot of the esoteric away. It takes a lot of the amorphous and makes it very tangible. And I think that's where it meets. And that's what helps. It's kind of like that's where the twain meet.
Mm-hmm.
Ankur, over to you.
So, out of all my subjects we study from childhood, I realized that science is the one whose basic purpose is the inquiry of truth, right? To find the truth, to find first principles, to find the fundamental building blocks of life, of matter, and their interaction, right? Now, Vedant, for instance, and yoga, for instance, specifically, is exactly the same. The pursuit of Vedant is to find the fundamental truth, define the first principles of life, the first principles of the mind, first principles of attention, and the foundational building blocks of human life. For instance, one of the interpretations we teach is called the system of life. That means, is life random, or is at some level it's predictable? And then if it's predictable, how does it move? What is station to station, right? And what's the beginning, what's the end, right? And what happens before or after that? And then the second is the system of mind, system of attention, right? Some of which even Carson has studied. So the pursuit of science, and at least the scriptures we are familiar with, the ones we work in, is the same. To A, discover the truth, B, define founding principles, the first principles on which it all works, right? And it is, as Shivani said, very exacting. What we found is very exacting, repetitively measurable, non-esoteric, non-fuzzy, yeah, exact. And they relate to human biology. That's why asking you questions on your sleep and food, we can tell you what's happening to your money, right? And for those of you, this is the basic form of the AI algorithm is free online, and anyone can take that test for free, and in 5 minutes you can find that out. So that sense, I don't think science and our work are at odds with each other. They're both inquiries, and I think they're going to merge. That's the future. That's the question that he was asking, and today it seems like alternate. It's just like some 20 years back, or some even 7 years back, people used to think that pink salt and white sugar and white salt, and then you have alternates. But today, actually, it's all becoming mainstream, right? The same thing's going to happen. All this is going to merge in our view, and that's what our scientific paper is also all about.
Yeah, yes. And this is one of the things that I personally really resonated with, traditions or systems from the East, quotes, but is that the frame typically, I mean, of course, there's devotional elements to experiencing the spiritual traditions within India, of course. But in my experience, the underlying core of the systems, be it Buddhist, and then previously Vedantic and yogic, are all replicable, right? So this is the thing that is in my mind the basis, of course, for the scientific path, which was a result, was in contradiction on the Western frame, at least, to extreme faith-based religious orientation towards the world, which was, belief. And there's nothing wrong with belief. But when it came forward, it obviously historically became a problem and a challenge for the church traditionally, because the scientific inquiry, democratized, that's not the right word, but brought forward the notion that replicable truth that could be measured or validated or what have you was also valid and also viable next to some of the faith traditions. But in the East, again, in India in particular, that's always been the case at one level, right? I mean, the yogis, the Buddhists, I mean, particularly the story of the Buddha, he never says, believe me. He doesn't say, trust me. It's always do the practices and see if what I'm saying makes sense to you. And, people have done that. And the same thing is true as all the great yogis as well. So anyway, I play with that. And to me, it's just an inquiry of how humans, to Scott's kind of point too, talking about this notion of the human divinity, that the human spark, that consciousness within the universe that completes that circuit of awareness in a sense. I don't know if that language makes sense to others, but it does to me. It's that awareness of our awareness, that knowing of our knowing, that kind of separates us. And these kinds of frames, particularly with Seeker or some of the secular, or not even secular, but meditation practices, of course, that come from Buddhism, really lean into that. It's just all brilliant. Just want to be mindful of the time. So Tom, I can imagine you probably have a few things to speak to. I don't want to monopolize this conversation. So I'm going to step back and give you space if you'd like to take it.
Yeah, I think there's so many things about the conversation today I appreciate, but science has been trying to catch up with, modern science has been trying to catch up with the ancient wisdom for centuries here in the West. And what I'm grateful for, the three of you and what you're doing is you're bringing information, you're bringing tools, you're bringing practices to the modern world that have always been there, but you're bringing them in a way that is making it more accessible for people who don't have the backgrounds, the traditions, the teachings, the teachers that have always been there. And it's building that bridge from the past to the present that's so needed. And I'm just grateful for the work that the three of you are doing.
Absolutely. So before we go on, I'll ask Ankur, Shivani, Scott, is there anything at this point that you'd like to speak to or anything that's up for you? And again, we'll start with the ladies first.
Well, I think it's been a great opportunity to talk about this work. And as Scott and Ankur would agree with me, we could be here all night, all day. Sorry, all night is because it's 10:36 p.m. my time. But we do this work because we think it's work worth doing. And in our experience, we have seen some simple practices which don't ask a lot of you, other than the fact that you be regular. We've seen it change the quality of people's lives. We've seen it change the quality of their sleep, the quality of their stress. And I believe that one of the things that's incumbent upon us is that if you chance upon a good thing, if you find something that fundamentally helps people, then it is very much our responsibility to share it and share it with anybody and everybody as loudly as we can and as with as much drive, passion, and strength as we can. So with that intention, we bring this work to you. And thank you so much for listening to us. And
yeah, well, thank you for coming on. And before we move to Ankur, I will say, just to your point, I personally have been benefited by the work of Seeker, and I can speak to that from a first-person experience. It's truly profound. And just to be, again, I'm using the word shameless a lot, but just to provide a shameless plug for Seeker, for those that are listening, it's very simple. Go to seeker.com, CEEKR.com, and take the test. It'll take 5 minutes, and you'll be very surprised with the results. So do that. Not right now. Do it after the podcast, but do it. It's amazing. So Ankur, anything for you? Any thoughts at this point?
No, I think the best thing we can do is listen to Scott.
Very good. I find that true to be
It's so much joy, when you hear a practitioner. I don't think the joy comes from his words alone. It comes from his being, and it's just
Thanks.
it's pleasure to be in his company.
I feel the same way. So Scott, anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, well, I wanted to get practical because people listening, there's two aspects. One is feeling yourself frustration, anger, craving, hopelessness. Like these are feelings probably everyone listening has felt within the last 24 hours. And also these bigger manifestations of that in the world, like war, which we talked about a lot at the beginning, the current conflicts in the world. So I think these are like the meaty questions, like practical things people are trying to address. And I just want to talk a little bit about at least the first steps toward addressing them, like from a Buddhist perspective and this, kind of more secular framework, from how to train a happy mind from Buddhism, which is that it starts with something really, really hopeful. and beautiful. Like, because a lot of times people think Buddhism is kind of depressing. Like they're always thinking about death and suffering. Well, I'll tell you, like a lesser known fact about Buddhism is that the grounding truth is that the mind is fundamentally good. Every single person's mind is fundamentally good at its basis. And it just gets clouded. Though all those delusions and manifestations of them in our world destroying the environment, they are still seen as light, even though they're pervasive, they're on the surface of our consciousness. And it's possible to let them go. And that is the cause of a happy mind and a happy world, is to let go of those delusions of like, craving, anger, realizing that, and separateness. A sense of separateness is one of the biggest problems in the mind. And that's what these practices do. I'm sure the ones that Shivani and Ankur are promoting sound like they're grounded in the same wisdom. And it's the same thing with this, that if you can do practices that help you realize your fundamental goodness and give you practical, simple steps every day to think of topics like how precious my life is, that things are impermanent, that people are fundamentally good, that love can be cultivated. It's actually a skill, like kindness, love, friendliness is a skill that can be cultivated. It's not just something some people are born with and some people aren't. I could go on for a few hours, but I just wanted to end like a more practically, for people in despair right now, honestly, despair about their own minds, despair about the world. Like there is a path out. Good things happen slowly, bad things happen fast is a quote from Stuart Brand, one of my heroes. So, but to start that slow path towards making yourself a cause of happiness and goodness in the world, and that ripples out. We aren't separate from that conflict in Gaza and Ukraine. Like the tiny actions we take, not just protesting, but just making ourselves friendlier and kinder and more patient, they do affect the wars in the world. And that's what the Dalai Lama says. I'm really quoting him with that.
Well, I appreciate that, Scott. Thank you. And it feels overwhelming at times. I mean, to say the least, in the sense of, I think in today's age, with our access to information and our ability to see the atrocities and to see the difficulty, another shooting happened yesterday in the United States at a celebration for the football team, the Kansas City Chiefs that won the Super Bowl, and someone brought forward a rifle and shot a bunch of people, and you can see that, and you can see that pain and that suffering so easily. It just it's difficult, and I wonder if kind of to the point of what you're making, as moderns, in the sense of us being alive with the tech that we have available to us. It's one thing if you hear about wars and difficulty in another far off place that you can't see and it's not visceral. And yet, how that affects the mind. How does that affect happiness? How does that affect our orientation in our own well-being or kindness towards others versus when it's right there front and center? So it's a difficult path. So I really appreciate what you're saying, Scott. Just to continue the shamelessness, when does your book come out?
Oh, the book
How can people get turned on?
Sure. Oh, thank you. The book comes out on March 12th. You can pre-order it now anywhere you buy books. It was available globally. And How to Train a Happy Mind. It has a foreword by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which was kind of shocking to me. So you can read a little bit of his words at the very beginning of the book.
Yeah, and people can also check out Skeptic's Path
Yeah.
to Enlightenment as a podcast too, which I know is
Yeah, we have a weekly podcast, and I guide some of these meditations and principles, and also do interviews with people from the Buddhist tradition, but also more and more other traditions, things like nonviolent communication and social justice and all kinds of other practitioners. Anyone who's practically working to make our minds happier and more constructive and help the world be a better place. There's so many paths. There's so many ways to do this.
Yeah. I particularly like the interview you did with Anil Seth, the neuroscientist, talking about consciousness. It was very, very profound.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to invite Jim back. Jim, if you're available to join us. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Ankur and Shivani and Scott. Again, it's a great privilege to have you here, but also just to know you. So anyway, thank you. So Jim, and thank you, Tom, for being here, and I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thank you, Carson. Thank you, Ankur and Shivani and Scott. Very illuminating. I want to just tease out one thing that you said, Scott, about the scientific investigation of meditation. You know, it's very important, I think, for us in the Western world to take in what you said, that in fact, science, with all the precision instrumentalities at the disposal of the Western mind, can describe the phenomenon and get a few tidbits there, here and there, but cannot get to the essence of the impact that it has on the human being. And I say this in light of, your opening remarks, Shivani and Ankur, about in antiquity, it was the East and it was India that had these flourishing, extraordinary civilizations, as did China, in a worldview that held holism and mindfulness as central. And I just wanted to make the point to get your responses that as long as we maintain the supremacy of Western science over the world will never get to where we started. And that it is only, in my view, overthrowing science supremacy, contextualizing it in its overthrow, not as something that needs to be discarded, but as something that needs to be brought back into the frame of the ancient wisdom, will we even begin to understand the world around us? And will we begin to have the capacity to solve our problems? So that the scientific mind that can barely tap into the miracle of mindfulness is actually, if you think about it at its deepest level, one of the greatest pillars in our imprisonment. And I just, in listening to you three speak from the point of view of ancient wisdom, I was getting weary of the modern world and the way we straitjacket ourselves in the ignorance of our arrogance. And so anyway, I just wanted to bring that in because that's how it impacted me. Would love to have your comments.
So
Go ahead.
go ahead, Houston.
Yeah, so His Holiness is very, very welcoming of science. He invited science in to like learn from them. But what happened with those discussions, if you talk to the scientists, it was about 95% scientists learning from His Holiness. Like most of them will say that's was what happened.
Exactly.
But it's very His Holiness loves science, and it's Thupten Jinpa, the Dalai Lama's translator. Really, he makes a very good distinction between modern science is oriented around the controlled experiment with like external measures, which is extraordinary innovation. But he says there's a broader type of science, which is about what Carson was saying, which is that if you follow this same process, you will get the same results. It's the replicability is the deeper principle. That is scientific too.
Good
And
point.
like and I think to see them as a whole, like we don't necessarily have to like overthrow science. It's like modern science is extraordinary. It's just that it's a subset of the bigger idea of being able to replicate results. The Buddha himself said this. Carson was alluding to it, but the quote from the Buddha is that he said, treat everything I tell you like gold, test it like gold. He said, bite it, chew it, scratch it, melt it. There aren't too many religions where the founder said, don't trust anything I said, verify them for yourselves. So the Buddha was a scientist. The Buddha was a scientist of the mind. So I just want to agree with you and also just expand with a couple of like references there to bring everything together. Like, I don't know if we have to like overthrow science. There are negative, destructive aspects of how science manifests, but the controlled experiment is a very important powerful subset of the idea of replicable truth. It's just that in sciences of the mind, you use your subjective experience to also validate those truths.
Sure. I was meaning to overthrow the supremacy of
Yes,
science.
yes, that is right on, right on.
That to me
Absolutely.
is an essential part of the transformation of our global worldview.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make it in part because one of our speakers last week had just come from Davos.
Mm.
And the tyranny of the transhumanist worldview
Yeah.
is that this Western scientific reductionist model of life and existence is the only box within which they operate and feel the world should operate. And the paradox is that even though they are engaging in that during the day, he said, at night over drinks, they're expressing agony at the consequence of that worldview. And the way that the three of you have just brought back into our consciousness the ancient wisdoms was just profoundly refreshing,
Thanks.
I must say.
Thank you.
And I would make another point is also, I think that what the Buddha did and what the Dalai Lama is doing is actually broadening the notion of science
Exactly.
to deep empirical research about reality itself, not as limited to the confines of time, space, and causality and the instrumentality of measurements that we happen to have at our disposal. Anyway, those are just comments, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Any comments, Shivani or Ankur? And then we'll hear from Carson and then Tom.
So I think the way this contradiction always exists, right? And belief is not just a thing that stays in religions. It's the believing physicists and the believing chemists who have also revolutionized the world, right? They've given us medicines and things like that. So belief has its own path, but I think if we learn from the ancient civilization, the yogic and the Vedic civilization, it says that all the subjects are important, especially science. What you need to do is add one more science to it, and that is the science of self, knowing the self. That's it. You don't need to change anything. Just add understanding your own mind to the equation, and then everything changes.
Great point.
And
Great
the
point.
largest epic story of that's told in our culture is that of Ram and Ravan, right? The righteous king, the Vishnu himself on earth versus Ravan, and they were both equally knowledgeable, equally, but one lived by the knowledge of self, and the other lived without the knowledge of self, and that's the polarity of evil versus good. That's how they teach it in our traditions.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, wow.
That's utterly profound if you think about it. That knowledge is universal but awareness is not. And one had the awareness of self and the other one did not. And that's the distinction between good and evil. That's very profound. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, it's funny you say that because in the Ramayana, we do that at my children's school that's been doing this for 45 years. They've been doing the play, and I appreciate that, Ankur, because I've seen my kids in it many times. And of course, the profundity has nothing to do with the fact that it's younger people performing the story. But it is very interesting. The notion of moving past, for me, I guess the thing that's been up is this notion of this hyper subject object dualism that's largely found, particularly in the Western frame, the one that's led to extractive thinking around the environment, extractive thinking around humans, et cetera. But yet, to Anker's point is the sense of moving beyond that subject-object dualism in my language or my thinking of it, and including sense of self as our own object. So just turning our gaze unto ourselves, or how to say, manifesting that gaze and being more harmonious. Because when we objectify and separate, then of course there's space to be harmful. So anyway, I think to your point, Jim, about the current scientific frame that's found in the West and so forth is the basis, of our legal systems and psychology and the DSM-5 or whatever it is, and all of those truth sayers in that sense. Yeah, it's a problem. And my intuition, I think it feels to me, at least, and this is what I was trying to get with Scott earlier, with his holiness, particularly with the mind and life work and so forth, that it feels like there's this great wisdom that it's coming together in the sense of traditional Eastern thinking, Western thinking, and the West is kind of hopefully going to catch up faster and be able to contextualize the importance of that knowledge of self. So anyway, I apologize. My words aren't entirely cohesive right now, but it's very profound and I appreciate it. So.
And I think, just to add to what everybody else has said, is one of the things that we understand, and Scott spoke about it, is it's practicing. When you're practicing, what you're really doing is you're building muscle. You're building a different type of muscle. And it doesn't just happen. It happens because you do it every day. And as he said, it's slow, because anybody who goes to the gym understands that building a body is a slow process. You don't just arrive at a fit body. Similarly, when we work on our mind, when we work on whether it's inclusiveness or compassion, what you're really talking about is that what mind muscle are you building? And if you stay with it, if you keep at it, that's what yogic science has said. They said, you do this every day, it will work. Mm-hmm. Because it's a science. Mm-hmm. You're building a different type of muscle. Mm-hmm. And everybody can do it. It's not just available to a select few. It's available to anybody who is willing to take that journey.
It's so, I love it that you just brought that in, that it's practice. This isn't like esoteric. It's a matter of practice. And it reminds me of Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, where he says that happiness is the pursuit of excellence. It's the accumulation of all the little choices you make every day. And if you just keep making the right choices, you get to where you're going. And he said the paradox is the indulgence gives you initial pleasure, but long-term suffering. The practice of the virtues give you initial suffering, like an athlete, doing weights, but long-term pleasure. So that we have to work out the choices within an ever-changing continuum of how we're feeling about it. Right. So it's so true. It is so true. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tom, do you want to have any closing comments? And then maybe Carson, you can tee us up for tomorrow.
Yeah, I think what I would just share is, here in the West, we suffer from the tyranny of equating the brain in our skull brain, to the mind. Mm-hmm. And what we've been speaking to today is the mind, not the skull brain. And until here in the West, we can recognize that the mind is more than just that piece of anatomy sitting between our ears. We'll continue to suffer. We'll continue to struggle with how to achieve some of the things we've been talking about today. And fortunately, Western science is helping inform through our understanding of the vagus nerve and the the brain that sits in our skull, the brain in our heart, the brain in our gut, and the interconnectedness that gets us closer to understanding the mind. And maybe with enough neuroscientific research, we can shift that paradigm and disconnect brain and mind.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Carson, what do we have for our grand finale tomorrow?
Yeah, well, we have we shift focus, and we are bringing in a series of practitioners and teachers. So we're going to have Mark Coleman and Lori Schwambeck will be joining us. Both of them are very amazing teachers. Lori Schwambeck in particular is just, I know her much more than I know Mark. I haven't had a chance to get to know Mark yet, but just amazing. And they ground their work in the sense of flourishing as it relates to what can nature teach us about that. How do we how are we in tune? What can we learn? It's my words, not theirs. So I'm very excited about that. And then we have another person, Claude Silver, who's joining us, and unfortunately has to travel. So she's going to be with us for the first part, and then we'll have to step away. But she's the Chief Heart Officer for a company called VaynerMedia, which is a big company that Gary Vaynerchuk has founded. Some people might be familiar with him or not, I'm not sure. But Gary has given the role to Claude of, again, not being the Chief Human Resources Officer, but the Chief Heart Officer. So she takes a practice, in my words, again, not hers, on how to show up. And I know she's in the process of writing a book on showing up and what does that mean. So how do we bring presence to self and in the same way to others? So that's what we'll be talking about tomorrow for our final day.
Thank you, Carson. Thank you, Tom, Ankur, Shivani, Scott. Thank you so much. This has been a very illuminating conversation. I just want to bring in a comment in the chat, which I think in some ways summarizes the conversation by Diana Windsor, that science should be seen as a subset of art. You know, I think that's actually quite a profound illumination, Diana. Thank you. You know, that all knowledge needs to be understood within the context of the pursuit of wisdom and the pursuit of the beautiful and the pursuit of cosmic harmony. And if it's contextualized within that frame, it becomes empowering and edifying. And if we lose track of that context, it can destroy us by imprisoning us in the limitations of our own avarice. So thank you for this conversation. I really have appreciated it. And that'll bring us to a close, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You also received it in your Zoom reminders for today. And then we'll see everybody tomorrow for our 5th and final session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jim, Carson.